Jerusalem was not a peaceful city that week. We tend to imagine it that way: quiet stones, soft golden light, a teacher moving calmly through reverent crowds. We picture Holy Week as something sacred and still, a spiritual tableau frozen in devotion. But that image belongs to stained glass windows and cathedral ceilings. It does not belong to the Jerusalem of the first century. What if everything you assumed about that week was shaped more by centuries of religious art than by historical reality? What if the tension, the noise, the danger, the smell of 10,000 pilgrims pressing through narrow gates were not the backdrop of the story, but the story itself? What if the reason Jesus' words cut so deeply was precisely because they were spoken in a city about to explode? Stay until the end, because understanding this changes how we read the Gospels. And it changes how we understand the kind of courage it took to walk into Jerusalem that Sunday morning. To understand Holy Week, you have to begin not with theology, but with geography. Jerusalem sat on a ridge in the Judean highlands, roughly 750 meters above sea level. In early spring, the air was cool and sharp in the mornings, dropping further at night, and the days carried that particular Mediterranean clarity where shadows are crisp and light feels almost physical. The city itself was not large by modern standards, perhaps 25,000 to 30,000 permanent residents in the lower and upper city districts, but during Passover, that number multiplied. Ancient sources, including the historian Josephus, describe figures that some scholars interpret as suggesting the population of Jerusalem could swell to several times its normal size during the feast. Conservative estimates still place the influx at tens of thousands of pilgrims arriving from across Judea, Galilee, the diaspora communities of Egypt and Babylon, from Rome itself. If you are finding this journey through the world of the Gospels meaningful, consider subscribing to this channel. New explorations like this one arrive regularly, and each one goes deeper into the world Jesus actually walked. They came on foot, mostly, families and village groups traveling together along the roads that wound through the Judean hills, carrying provisions, sleeping under open skies or in roadside inns, arriving dusty and tired and electrically expectant. Passover was not simply a religious observance in the abstract sense. It was the central event of the Jewish year, the annual reliving of the Exodus, the moment when every Jewish family reclined together and remembered that God had once broken the chains of an empire. In a land under Roman occupation, that memory carried weight that words alone cannot fully hold. The city they were entering had been transformed in the decades before that week. Herod the Great, who had died roughly 30 years earlier, had undertaken a rebuilding of the Jerusalem temple so ambitious and so technically staggering that it was considered one of the architectural wonders of the ancient world. The Temple Mount platform itself, an artificial esplanade built over the original hill, measured roughly 300 meters from north to south and nearly 500 meters from east to west, supported by massive retaining walls whose foundation stones weighed hundreds of tons and whose precision-cut surfaces still astonish engineers today. The royal stoa on the southern end of the platform was a colonnaded basilica so vast that its interior space could have contained the entire population of many Galilean villages simultaneously. This was the building pilgrims saw as they crested the Mount of Olives from the east. In morning light, its white limestone and gold fittings caught the sun so intensely that witnesses described it as painful to look at directly. The temple was not merely a religious site. It was the center of the Jewish economy, the seat of religious authority, the place where the world made sense. Its existence was the visible argument that God had not abandoned his people, and it was, at the same time, the place where Roman power and Jewish religious authority met in an arrangement that served them both, and which the population of that city understood with the intimate clarity of the poor, to be built partly on their backs. The streets around the temple complex in that final week of Jesus' life would have been almost incomprehensible in their density and activity. The lower city, where most common pilgrims camped or crowded into the homes of relatives and strangers who rented floor space during the feast, was a maze of narrow lanes where stone walls sweated moisture in the morning cold, and the smell of cooking fires mixed with the smell of animals and unwashed bodies, and the sharp, metallic scent that drifted from the temple courts where sacrificial animals were slaughtered in numbers that ancient sources describe in almost industrial terms. The temple required animals. Hundreds of thousands of animals over the course of the Passover season, lambs primarily, but also doves for those who could not afford lambs, cattle for the wealthier offerings. These animals had to be purchased, inspected for ritual purity, and brought to the priests. This is why the outer courts of the temple, the court of the Gentiles, the vast public space accessible to all, had become a marketplace. Money changers sat at their tables because Roman coins bearing the image of Caesar were not acceptable for temple taxes and offerings, and pilgrims arriving from across the empire carried Roman coins. The exchange was necessary. It was also, for many pilgrims, a moment of exposure to rates they had no power to contest and no alternative to accept. This is the city into which Jesus entered on Sunday morning, riding on a young donkey, with crowds cutting palm branches and laying cloaks on the road and crying words from Psalm 118. Hosanna! Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. Words that carried a particular electric charge in a city full of people who were, in the deepest sense of the word, waiting for rescue. The entry into Jerusalem was not a private moment. It could not have been. The road from the Mount of Olives descended into the Kidron Valley and then rose again toward the eastern gates of the city. And anyone standing on the Temple Mount or on the walls above the gate could see a procession coming from a considerable distance. The crowd that accompanied Jesus had been building since Bethany, the small village on the eastern slope of the Mount of Olives where he had been staying. A walk of roughly 3 kilometers. Enough time for word to move ahead and for people to press toward the road from both directions, from the city outward and from the surrounding encampments inward. What the procession looked like from the perspective of those watching from the walls or from upper windows is worth pausing to consider. A man on a young donkey, surrounded by a crowd waving branches and shouting words associated with the Davidic kingship, approaching a city already saturated with pilgrims whose defining shared memory was liberation from empire. This was not a quiet or ambiguous image. Roman soldiers stationed in the Antonia fortress, which stood at the northwestern corner of the Temple Mount precisely so that its towers could overlook the temple courts and the surrounding streets, would have been watching. The chief priests, whose political survival depended on managing exactly this kind of moment, would have been informed immediately. The Gospels record that the Pharisees in the crowd told Jesus to rebuke his disciples, to quiet them. His response, that if they were silent, the very stones would cry out, is often read as a poetic declaration. In its historical context, it was also a statement of inevitability. What was happening could not be undone by lowering voices. The week had begun. To understand the pressure building inside that city, you have to understand the role that Passover played in the Roman calculus of control. The feast commemorated the defeat of the most powerful empire of its age by a god who acted on behalf of enslaved people. Every year, without exception, that story was retold in every Jewish home in the empire, and every year the Roman administration in Judea took extraordinary precautions. The governor, in this case Pontius Pilate, whose normal residence was in the coastal city of Caesarea Maritima, relocated to Jerusalem for the feast, bringing additional cohorts with him. The Roman military presence in the city during Passover was substantially reinforced precisely because Roman intelligence understood what the feast meant and what it could ignite. Pilate was not a man inclined toward subtlety. The historical record outside the Gospels, Josephus, Philo of Alexandria, describes a prefect who had already demonstrated willingness to use lethal force against Jewish populations, and who understood his role in Judea primarily in terms of maintaining Roman order and extracting Roman revenues. His presence in Jerusalem during Passover was itself a message. Whatever you are remembering, whoever you are waiting for, the empire is here. Into this compressed atmosphere, tens of thousands of pilgrims reinforced Roman troops, a temple establishment walking a careful line between religious authority and political survival. A population carrying generations of occupation fatigue. Jesus arrived and went directly to the temple. What he did there on Monday, the day after his entry, has been described in every tradition as the cleansing of the temple. The overturning of the money changers' tables, the driving out of those selling animals. The Gospels describe it with varying degrees of detail, but the core is consistent. He entered the outer courts and disrupted the commerce that had come to occupy that space. To feel the weight of this act, you have to stand inside the reality of that space. The court of the Gentiles was enormous. The largest public space in the city by far. It was also, during Passover week, a place of extraordinary density and noise. Animals lowed and bleated. Coins clinked and clattered across stone surfaces. Merchants called out their wares. Pilgrims argued over exchange rates they could not understand in currencies they did not normally use. The smell of animals in quantity, their fear, their waste. The particular smell of large, warm bodies pressed together in a stone enclosure was immediate and physical. The tables of the money changers were not incidental furniture. They were load-bearing elements of the entire sacrificial system. Without them, the temple tax could not be paid. Without the animal sellers, pilgrims who had traveled for days or weeks without their sacrificial animal, because transporting a lamb from Galilee over 3 days of walking roads while keeping it ritually unblemished was genuinely difficult, had no recourse. The system existed because it solved real logistical problems. It also, like most systems that solve real problems for captive populations, extracted a cost that those with the least power were least able to contest. When Jesus overturned those tables, he was not performing a spontaneous act of spiritual frustration. He was making a statement that every person in that court, pilgrim, priest, merchant, Roman observer, understood immediately and differently. For the pilgrims, many of whom had traveled far and spent money they had carefully saved for this moment, and who had stood at those tables feeling the particular vulnerability of someone who has no alternative, his action spoke to something they had not been permitted to say aloud. For the temple establishment, it was a direct challenge to the economic and religious order they administered. For the Romans watching from the Antonia Towers, it was exactly the kind of disruption that required monitoring and, if necessary, response. The Gospels record that after this act, the chief priests and the teachers of the law began looking for a way to kill him. The language is direct and without elaboration. They were not looking for a way to discredit him theologically or to debate him into irrelevance. They were looking for a way to end him. The week had moved from tension into something with a specific trajectory. And yet, and this is one of the most historically striking details of the entire week, they were afraid of the crowd. That phrase appears repeatedly in the Gospel accounts when the authorities consider acting against Jesus directly. They could not arrest him openly in the temple courts or on the streets because the crowd that surrounded him, the thousands of pilgrims for whom he had just done what they could not do themselves, would have responded in ways that none of the parties involved, not the priests, not Pilate, not the temple guards, wanted to manage in a city already at its limits. This is the shape of the trap that was forming around everyone in Jerusalem that week. It was not a trap with one side. The religious authorities needed to remove a threat without triggering a riot. The Romans needed to maintain order without creating the martyrdom that would make order impossible. Jesus continued teaching daily in the temple courts, publicly, surrounded by crowds, in the heart of the most scrutinized space in the city, saying things that the Gospels record with the calm precision of someone who understood exactly what each word cost. The days between Monday and Thursday moved with a rhythm that the Gospels capture in fragmented but telling detail. Each morning, Jesus returned to the temple courts. Each evening he withdrew, back across the Kidron Valley, back up the eastern slope to Bethany or to the gardens on the Mount of Olives, where the olive trees were old enough that their trunks had grown into shapes that looked almost architectural, gnarled and massive in the way of things that have absorbed decades of wind and drought and survived them. The city, by contrast, did not offer that kind of withdrawal. Inside the walls, there was nowhere that was not observed, nowhere that was not dense with the particular compressed energy of a population waiting for something none of them could fully name. In the temple courts during those days, the encounters recorded in the Gospels have the quality of a series of tests being run against a man whom his opponents could not yet reach by force. The Pharisees came with a question about Roman taxes, the famous question about the coin bearing Caesar's image, designed to trap him between collaboration and sedition. The Sadducees came with a question about resurrection, a theological dispute in which they hoped to expose him as philosophically naive. Teachers of the law came with questions about the greatest commandment. Each exchange was not merely a conversation, it was a public performance in front of crowds, and the crowds were watching not only for content but for the quality of the man, whether he could hold his ground, whether he would flinch, whether the pressure of the week was changing him. He did not flinch. The Gospels record his answers to each challenge with a compression that suggests these were not long deliberations, but immediate responses. The answers of someone who had been living inside these questions for a long time and had arrived at Jerusalem already knowing what he believed and what he was willing to say in the presence of people who wanted to use his words to destroy him. But it is what he said, when the formal challenges paused, that cuts deepest into the historical texture of that week. Sitting in the temple courts near the treasury, a specific location, a place where people came to deposit their offerings into the large trumpet-shaped receptacles that lined the wall, Jesus watched the crowd moving past. The Gospels record that wealthy people came and deposited large amounts. Then a widow came and deposited 2 small copper coins, lepta, the smallest denomination in circulation, worth together a tiny fraction of a day's wage. Jesus turned to his disciples and said that she had given more than all the others, because they had given from their surplus and she had given from her poverty everything she had to live on. To hear this only as a compliment to generosity is to hear only part of what was said. In its context, a temple whose construction and maintenance had been funded partly through obligations imposed on people with exactly as much as that widow had, it carried an edge. The widow was giving her last coins to a system whose courts Jesus had disrupted 2 days earlier for extracting too much from those who could least afford it. Whether his words were an indictment of the system or a lament or both, the disciples were watching a man who noticed the widow in a week when the city was full of things demanding to be noticed. Roman soldiers, priestly delegations, crowds, the architecture of imperial power, and who found her more worth attending to than any of them. This quality of attention is one of the most historically distinctive things about the figure the Gospels present. In a world that organized nearly every social interaction around honor and shame, around the visible markers of status that determined where you stood in a crowd, who spoke to you, whether you were seen at all, in that world, He consistently looked at the people the system was designed to render invisible. The widow, the leper standing outside the gate, the tax collector up in the tree. This was not sentiment. In a society where honor was a form of currency and shame was a form of poverty, the act of seeing someone was not trivial. It had weight. On Tuesday or Wednesday, the Gospels do not perfectly synchronize their chronology for these middle days. Something happened away from the public gaze that would shape the rest of the week entirely. One of the 12 disciples, Judas Iscariot, went to the chief priests and offered to hand Jesus over to them at a moment when the crowds were not present. The Gospels record that they were glad and agreed to pay him 30 pieces of silver, 30 shekels, a sum that appears in the book of Exodus as the compensation paid for a slave killed by negligence, a detail whose symbolic weight the Gospel of Matthew explicitly connects. The agreement created the mechanism the authorities had been unable to engineer through public confrontation. They now had someone on the inside, someone who knew where Jesus withdrew at night, someone who could lead temple guards to a location away from the crowd, away from the witnesses, away from the political complications of a public arrest. The trap that had been forming around the week closed one more degree. What was happening inside Judas during those days is one of the great unreachable questions of the story. The Gospels offer different framings: greed, the work of Satan, a fulfillment of prophecy, but none of them fully open the interior of the man. What we can say with historical grounding is that disappointment and disillusionment in first-century Jewish messianic movements were not rare. The gap between what people hoped a leader would do and what he actually did was a gap that had broken movements before and would break them again. Whether Judas had expected something different from the temple confrontation, something more decisive, something that looked more like the liberation Passover promised, we cannot know. What the Gospels record is the outcome. And the outcome was an agreement made in private while the city moved through its last ordinary days before the feast. Thursday arrived with the specific weight of preparation. Passover required a lamb. It required the lamb to be slaughtered at the temple in the afternoon, its blood collected by the priests and poured against the base of the altar, its carcass returned to the family to be roasted whole and eaten that night with unleavened bread and bitter herbs, reclining at the table in the posture of free people. Because in Egypt, slaves ate standing, ready to move at a moment's notice, and free people reclined. Every element of the meal was a physical argument against bondage. Jesus sent 2 disciples into the city to prepare the Passover meal. The Gospels record that he gave them a sign to follow. A man carrying a water jar, an unusual sight because water carrying was predominantly women's work, which would have made such a man immediately visible in the street. They followed him to a house, went to the upper room, and prepared the meal. The upper room, the anagaion in Greek, a large furnished room on the upper floor, was a space of some status. Not every home in Jerusalem had an upper room large enough for 13 people to recline at table. Someone had arranged this. Someone with access to such a space had made it available. The anonymity of that person in the Gospel accounts is one of the quiet mysteries of the week. A name withheld, a kindness preserved only as an architectural detail, an upper room that held the last meal. Outside, the city was preparing in 10,000 other upper rooms and courtyards and cramped spaces for the same meal. The smell of roasting lamb would have been everywhere as evening approached, drifting from rooftop to rooftop, through the narrow lanes, across the valleys. Every family in Jerusalem that night was remembering the same story. One table among them was about to become something that no one at it fully understood yet. The meal began as it always began. The head of the household, and Jesus functioned in that role at this table, however unconventionally, took the cup, blessed it, and passed it. He took the unleavened bread, broke it, and distributed it. These were gestures so familiar to everyone in that room that they required no explanation, no instruction. Every person reclining at that table had performed these rituals since childhood, had heard the questions asked and the answers given, had tasted the bitter herbs and the salt water that stood for tears and the sea, had heard the Hallel Psalms sung in the particular way that Passover evening demanded. The ritual was the memory, and the memory was the identity, and the identity was the reason they were still a people after centuries of exile and occupation and loss. But something happened at this table that did not happen at any other table in Jerusalem that night. When Jesus took the bread and broke it, he said that it was his body. When he took the cup, he said that it was his blood of the covenant, poured out for many. The disciples heard these words inside a ritual they knew completely, and the words did not fit the ritual, not in any way that made immediate sense. The Passover bread was the bread of affliction, the bread of haste, the bread of slaves who left Egypt without time for leaven. The Passover cup was the cup of redemption. He was not replacing these meanings. He was layering something over them that they did not yet have the frame to receive. John's Gospel, which handles this final evening with extraordinary slowness and detail, does not record the words over the bread and cup. Instead, it records something else that happened at the same meal, something so socially disorienting that Peter's reaction to it is the most human moment in the entire Passion narrative. Jesus rose from the table, removed his outer garment, wrapped a towel around his waist, and poured water into a basin and began to wash his disciples' feet. Foot washing was not an act of hygiene in the abstract. In a world where people walked on unpaved roads in sandals, feet arrived at any meal dirty in a way that was immediate and physical. The washing of a guest's feet was the work of the lowest-ranking servant in a household, so low-ranking, in fact, that some rabbinic traditions suggest that a Hebrew slave should not be required to do it, that it was work reserved for Gentile slaves or for someone who performed it voluntarily as an act of exceptional devotion. When Peter saw Jesus move toward him with the basin, his reaction, "You will never wash my feet," was not stubbornness. It was the response of a man watching something that violated every category he had for understanding the relationship between a teacher and his students, between honor and its proper distribution. Jesus told him that if he did not allow it, he would have no part with him. Peter, characteristically, immediately overcorrected, "Not just my feet then, but my hands and my head." The exchange has the warmth and the slight absurdity of a real conversation between people who know each other well enough to be honest. And then Jesus dried their feet and returned to the table and asked them if they understood what he had done. They did not. Not yet. Not fully. But the image was now inside them, and images of that kind do not leave. Sometime during the meal, Jesus said that one of them would betray him. The Gospels record that the disciples looked at one another, uncertain who he meant. John's account describes the beloved disciple leaning back against Jesus and being told quietly that it would be the one to whom he gave the piece of bread after dipping it, and then Judas receiving it, and then leaving. The Gospel records with a stillness that feels almost cinematic that it was night. It was night. That single phrase in the original Greek carries the full weight of what was beginning. After the meal and the singing of the final Hallel Psalms, they left the upper room and went out across the Kidron Valley and into the garden on the western slope of the Mount of Olives. Gethsemane, a name that means oil press, a working agricultural space where the massive stone presses that extracted oil from harvested olives still stood among the old trees. It was a place Jesus apparently knew well, a place he had gone before, which is precisely why Judas knew where to find him. What happened in that garden in the hours before midnight is recorded in the Gospels with a kind of directness that resists theological softening. Jesus asked his disciples to stay awake with him. He went a short distance further and fell to the ground and prayed that if it were possible, the cup might pass from him. He returned and found them sleeping. He went back and prayed the same prayer. He returned and found them sleeping again, 3 times. The repetition is not literary. It is the texture of a man in genuine agony, working through something that required more than one pass. The prayer in Gethsemane is the moment in the entire Passion narrative where the historical and the theological converge most uncomfortably and most honestly. A man alone in a garden at night, while his closest companions slept, asking whether the thing that was coming could be avoided. This is not the image of someone performing courage. It is the image of someone paying the actual cost of it. Courage that costs nothing is not courage. What the garden shows is a man who saw clearly what was ahead, who felt the full human weight of it, and who chose to remain. The arrest came before the night was finished. Judas arrived with a crowd carrying swords and clubs sent by the chief priests and the elders, not Roman soldiers initially, but temple guards, a Jewish arrest conducted under Jewish religious authority, which mattered legally for the process that would follow. The signal Judas had arranged was a greeting and a kiss, a gesture of respect between a student and a teacher, a gesture of closeness turned into the mechanism of identification in the dark. There was a brief moment of resistance. Peter drew a sword and cut off the ear of the high priest's servant, a man named Malchus, the only victim of that night whose name the Gospels preserve. Jesus stopped it. He healed the ear. And then he was led away, and the disciples scattered into the darkness, and the city continued sleeping around events it would not fully know about until morning. The trials that followed in the remaining hours of that night and into the morning of Friday have a compressed and brutal quality that historical scholarship has long examined for their procedural irregularities. A Sanhedrin convened at night, a Roman prefect pressured into a verdict he initially resisted, a crowd whose composition and motivations the Gospels present differently from one another. What the historical record allows us to say with confidence is that by mid-morning on Friday, Jesus was being crucified outside the walls of Jerusalem, in a location visible from the road, because crucifixion was Roman public theater, a demonstration of what empire did to those who disturbed its order, displayed where the maximum number of people would see it and carry the image home with them. The city was full. The pilgrims who had cried Hosanna on Sunday were still there. The Passover meal they had eaten the night before was still with them. The lamb's blood was still drying on the doorposts of memory. And outside the walls, on a hill called the Place of the Skull, the week arrived at the end that had been building since Sunday morning, with the slow and terrible logic of a world that does not bend easily toward mercy. This is what Holy Week actually was, not a spiritual retreat, not a quiet procession through devotional stations. It was a city under occupation, packed beyond its limits, watched by soldiers, managed by frightened authorities, full of people carrying the specific hope of the desperate that this time, somehow, something would change. And into that city, into that week, into that very human knot of fear and power and longing and betrayal, walked a man who knew exactly where it was going and went anyway. The stones of Jerusalem have absorbed a great deal, but they have not forgotten this week. And neither, once you understand what it actually was, will you?